So coloniality, to me, is not just a question of military occupation during a specific period of time, but the severely uneven power relations implemented through political, economic, and cultural infrastructures that are directed from outside of the society and continue to exist in different forms, even long after the colonial period has ended. But these colonial uneven social relations are not imposed upon naive and innocent societies, but sutured through existing local hierarchical social orders. Starting from the 16th century through the 20th century, European powers such as Portugal, the Netherlands, Spain, Britain, respectively established their colonies in different historical period over the Southeast and Northeast Asian region for as long as 300 years or more, or as short as several decades. But from the mid-19th century, Japan and US also launched their colonial project in East Asia. But after World War II in the 20th century, these regions started the movement of the independence and various forms of restructuring and nation building. This project of decolonization paradoxically resumed the exercise of previous colonialism within and among the neighboring regions, involving massive massacres, genocide, forced internal migrations, class conflict basing on new forms of racism, highly centralized power structure through privatization of land and capital, linked with the corruption of government, governmental bureaucratic system, and so on. I will not comment on this because either Benedict Anderson or Arif Derlig or Haritonian, they had studied and wrote many on this. But Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, like there's in the Philippines, mestizo, okay, this political leader, military powers, financial elite collide to maintain their chieftain rule. Okay, not to mention previously like Indonesia's rule of Timor and West Papua, and still going on. And the pan-Indonesia or pan-Malaysia concept turned out also to be, for Indonesia, its internal coloniality. But for Singapore, okay, which was driven away from Malaysia because of after the independence. But then Singapore's development became a different form for them to treat Malaysia migrant workers as lower class migrant or outsiders. And even though they speak the same language, even though they speak the same language with different accent, but they can tell the racist differences, okay, according to basing on their different accent. So it's not only Southeast Asia, but Northeast Asia too, okay. Like Korea after the Korean War, the dictatorship, and they accumulated in their Guangzhou massacre, okay. And in Taiwan, certainly, state of exception for more than 37 years, okay. But it's protected, okay. Guaranteed the security through U.S. Foreign aid, military base, and internalized McCarthyism. Okay, so that had long effect. Those are the effective regime that's constantly and surfacing in contemporary societies. So the question will be, is it because the act of decolonization was not thorough enough? Is it because the colonial unconscious remained in the psyche of the colonized people so that they either want to assume the position of the colonizer or to repeat the position of the colonized? Or you see the revival of the feudal tributary system in the form of the colonial institution, as a way Japan practiced during the period of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere as a core of the hegemony in Asia. And has this tribute system returned today through regional economic partnership in the age of neoliberalism? So my central thesis is in this article is that there is no way to fully discuss the question of coloniality or to undertake the task of decolonization unless we look into the collaborative apparatus in the local societies, both in terms of institutional and epistemological infrastructures. To me, it is crucial to analyze how the existing power structure of the local societies actively suture with a new system imposed or translated from outside and transfer into newly devised institutions. It is also crucial to engage with a related questions such as what discursive mode and semiotic practices from historical past that has been revived and conjured up through the process of translation in order to meet with the demand of the time. And also, why does the hierarchical order in the pre-colonial time remain in the colonial period and even the post-colonial societies, though in different discursive form or through different institutional practices? In this regard, I think the question of tribute system in Sinosphere or the Sinic world that had influenced the historical processes in East Asia, especially through the discursive politics of Confucianism, is worth our attention. We need to look into the dual practices of tribute system collaborative with the colonial government, and especially how it has transformed from the old tributary relation into a new colonialism in our age of neoliberalism today. The purpose of my inquiry is to think whether and how it is possible for us to really de-subordinize the discursive and institutional coloniality through the analysis of the internal colonial border, so that we can think the question of radical equality and radical democracy in our contemporary society. To suggest to look into the power relation, the power structure of local institutions and cultural infrastructures is not to dismiss the colonial violence in the historical processes. On the contrary, it is the symbolic violence of the institutional and discursive inequality justified by the colonial regime that is the core of my concern here. But I need to stress that it is exactly through the local collaborative subjective apparatuses, such as local gentries, landlords, factory owners, harbor masters, intellectual compradors, and even local government, that the colonial structure was accommodated and localized through creative transformation, both discursively and institutionally. It is also because of such discursive and institutional configurations that the coloniality could be deep-rooted even in the epistemic level and remain effective in the post-colonial society today. The project of decoloniality is rapidly developing in recent 2 decades. And it is not a surprise that both the historians and philosophers from the global north or the global south or the third world have turned their gaze to the non-European world, such as Africa, South America, and Asia, in order to search for different modes of modernity and alternative epistemologies. This epistemological decolonizing project points out that the Enlightenment knowledge with its modernity project was developed in a very specific context and a specific moment in Western Europe, but was considered as universal values and was disseminated globally through the capitalist expansion and imperial colonization, even has shaped the epistemological structures and the worldview through the historical processes. In order to challenge the Eurocentric knowledge production and worldview, scholars try to excavate the plurality of different historical processes, present different perspectives of the age of commerce and the making of the modern world economy in the non-European world. For example, the discovery of the Asiatic Mediterranean in East Asia, the prosperous urban civilization in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, starting from the 13th or the 14th century, even more developed than the cities in Europe, and the resurrection of the ignored and subalternized knowledge from the non-European world, and so on. Such a wave of the epistemological decolonization project is, of course, different from previous post-colonial theories with its jargons as hybridity, creolization, mimicry. Walter Mignolo has examined or criticized the concept of hybridization. He points out that this concept could incur the assumption not only of the mixture of previously pure blood and pure culture, but also the smooth process of liquid flow and blending of different cultures and different knowledges. Mignolo shows how Otis' application of the concept of transculturation would invoke the biological cultural mixture of people and conceive the entire history of Cuba as a long process of transculturation in order to define a national feature of Cuban history. Instead of the concept of transculturation, it is helpful for us to consider the term colonial semiosis used by Mignolo to analyze the conflict engendered by coloniality at the level of social semiotic interactions in the sphere of science, so that we can examine the long process of subalternization of knowledge that privileges particular frame and conception of knowledge based on the distinction between epistemology and hermeneutics deriving from Europe, while subalternizing other kinds of knowledge. Through the concept of colonial semiosis and the notion of the conflict in the sphere of science, we could be more aware of the play of science on the semiotic level within and beyond the regime of translation that introduces multiple strata of discursive and institutional competition and appropriation. When it comes to the question of the regime of translation, it is clear that it is not merely about the translation on the linguistic level, but a complex network of semiotic and institutional transference. Mignolo also suggests that in the process of translation, the colonial differences could be easily erased and the colonial power structure would be naturalized and internalized in local practices. So he therefore proposes the task of epistemic disobedience and epistemic delinking by resorting to border thinking in order to revive the differences that have been suppressed. He emphatically defines border thinking as referring to the subaltern knowledge that is outside of the modern colonial world system. But the question is, where is the border? When Mignolo discusses Du Weiming, a Chinese philosopher of the 20th century, contemporary actually, his comments on Confucianism as a powerful exercise of border thinking from the perspective of epistemological subalternity, I find his argument quite troubling. Apparently, he is conscious of the stake he plays to take non-Western knowledge, such as Confucianism, as alternative to Western or modern epistemology, because he is also aware of the fact that Du has been criticized by the Chinese leftist intellectuals as using Confucian ethics to replace the Protestant ethic in support of Eastern capitalism. He nevertheless still puts his trust in the epistemological potential of Confucianism to perform with different purposes from the capitalist logic. He further emphasizes that the alternatives to modern epistemology such as can hardly come only from Western epistemology itself, and suggests that those analytic and critical reflections of the limits of modern epistemology has demonstrated a powerful exercise of border thinking. The assumption of another epistemology outside of the modern Western world, such as Confucianism, can offer some kind of alternative, I think, is exactly the myth of a specialized perception of knowledge that scholars of the colonial project could easily be trapped into. The hemispheric turn of the historical and political philosophical gaze from the north to the south, if not handled well, would be trapped in a typical anthropological apparatus of area partitions and a mode of specialization of knowledge. The implied colonizer-colonized dichotomy, or the West and the rest distinction, still conceals the picture of the relational processes of the colonial history and the true question of coloniality. To shift the gaze from the West to the East, such as Asia or Africa, is to adopt the same mode of specialization of knowledge exercised by area studies or national literature or national history, and assume the centrality and exclusivity of space in the constitution of social order and national culture. Such mode of hypostatization and fetishization of the geographical space, be it Europe or Asia, the West or the East, is to ignore the reality of the simultaneously intertwining and interacting historical processes and the coexistence of different temporalities in the same space that constitute local cultural social orders. What is presented as genealogical, homogeneous, and consistent essence of a culture is clearly an ideological operation, as a Chinese civilization would claim. Histories are always long processes of semiotic syncretism, acculturation, and reformulation. The transcultural traffic of ideas, however, is never without rivalry of power structures, especially when there are asymmetrical power relations. In the process of translation through selecting, filtering, and reinscribing, as discussed nicely and succinctly by Naoki Sakai, certain discursive modes of power relations could be prioritized according to the subject position of the translator. We also need to be aware of the fact that the practice of translation oftentimes is done through the disguise of local vocabularies in order to normalize and facilitate the institution of certain values that favor certain interests and to answer the demand of the time. The introduction and translation of the Enlightenment knowledge from Western Europe into Chinese society from the end of the 19th century through the beginning of the 20th century was one typical example. Traditional Chinese, in particular Confucian phraseology and discursive logic, were employed in the process of translation and effected gradual but fundamental paradigm shift and of knowledge production, even in Confucianism itself. Such paradigmic shift in knowledge production also achieves the effect of the alteration of the affective regime built upon the epistemological platform involving the sensibility of attraction and exclusion in ethical, political, and aesthetic dimensions. To historicize this moment of conjunctures is to re-examine the complex articulations of power behind the semiotic, discursive, and institutional actors. The question for us is to see how local power structures, both epistemological and institutional ones, adopt foreign power structure while at the same time inherit traditional power structures and transform itself into new institutional forms during and after the colonial period. So it is this creative transformation of Confucianism that rooted itself in East Asia. Du Weiming's statement concerning Confucian selfhood as creative transformation, to me, is exactly the erasure of colonial difference that took place and where the coloniality of power was enacted through semiotic syncretism. It is not a question of the confrontation between Confucianism against Christianity or that between Confucianism against mystical Taoism, but the question of the capacity of the creative transformation of Confucian selfhood that the global design was adapted, implemented, and reinvented through local Confucian knowledge in order to adjust itself to the contemporary political economic conditions. The project of the semiotic discursive syncretism through Confucianism from the end of 19th century through the beginning of the 20th century is to pave the path toward the building of the nation state in the fashion of the economic military nationalism, 金铁主义, gold medalism, as demonstrated by the Enlightenment scholars such as Liang Qichao, Yang Du, Kang Youwei, and so on, and their contemporaries. The anti-communist campaign in the democratic liberalist regime in the Cold War by the neo-Confucianist scholars in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore in the 60s, as well as a discourse of the Confucian enterprise spirit, 企业精神, in the name of new Confucian ethics and Asian values promoted by Du Weiming in his lectures in Singapore in 1982, also have provided perfect cases of that epitomize the question of epistemological transformation through Confucianism to cope with the demand of the time. His lecture in Singapore was invited by Li Guangyao. When Li Guangyao stressed that the Confucianism should be included in this moral education in the school. Li Guangyao specified that this should be one of the elective courses in religious study for moral education. And in his lecture, Stu stressed that the supporting system of a society needs to adapt itself not only to new ways of living, but also to new demands of the time. He suggested that in the age of highly developed technology and competitive administration, the sense of responsibility, self-restraint, self-cultivation, spirit of consensus and cooperation, valuing the leadership of the community or in the industry and government, respecting the procedure and ritual of the production are the Confucian ethics shared in East Asia. These Confucian virtues proved to be the reasons also for him for the miraculous economic success of the 5 little dragons in East Asia, including Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore in the post-war era. Of course, he admitted that there are the dark side of the Confucianism, that the politicized dimension, that favor the authoritarian state power, prioritization of politics and collectivity and bureaucracy in Chinese history. But he said this is only the dark side. But The question for us here is that we cannot separate the Confucian political practice from its discursive ideology. Ever since Han Dynasty like 100 years BC, Zhongshu successfully, creatively developed his Confucian political theories basing on a very mystical text, 春秋公羊, and stressed the mystical correspondence between the cosmological order with the social order of mankind, and the legitimacy of the mandate monarch with a hierarchical subordination system. The concept of loyalty and filial piety also was particularly emphasized, and it is also put into the penal system in Han Dynasty. So Dong and his contemporaries, Confucian officials, also implemented a complicated penal system, appropriating different Confucian classics and different Confucian ethics to the effect that the so-called Confucianism is actually a mixture of the school of legalism in its core, that is a practice of the governmentality, FA, and so-called Confucianism as the appearance, 外儒内法, Confucianism as a cult, and the practice of the dominative authoritarian governmentality inside throughout Chinese history. And the mystic logic of mandate monarch and the hierarchical order between the emperor and its subject, together with the imperial examination as a selection system from the official bureaucracy, and the academies run by local gentes and ancestral temples, and the Confucian ethics that they upheld, formed together a firm substratum for the continuation of the empire. Such political system in the name of Confucianism also constitute the center-periphery relations of the inter-regional tribute system in East Asia that Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and other regions also practiced in history in their own mode. The coexistence of Confucian discourse of ethic with its practice of governmentality exemplified itself through the history of different dynasties, even after the fall of the imperial regime. Since the beginning of the Republic of China in the 20th century, all political rulers were inclined to employ the discourse of reviving Confucianism through 复古, returning to the past, 尊孔, worshipping Confucius, and 读经, reading classics, in order to justify their legitimacy of their autocratic rules. Obvious examples are Yuan Shikai, who claimed himself as the emperor after the revolution, in the Republic era, and the warlord in the northern government, 北洋政府, that occupied different previous provinces through military forces during the period of northern government from the revolution, the beginning of the Republic, till 1927-28. And Chiang Kai-shek, of course, of the Nanjing government, launched total militarization through the New Life movement in 1934, also started the Chinese cultural renaissance through his New Life movement, and resumed in his rule in Taiwan through martial law in the 60s. And even the Japanese rule in Manchuria government and in Taiwan also practiced the policies of 复古, 尊孔, and 读经. So all the strategies of governmentality have attested the political function of Confucian ideology held for the centralization and militarization of the ruling government to rationalize its legitimacy and its concentration of power. Because of this background, that it's more curious for us to see the revival of Confucianism in China in recent decades in support of the expansion of the rise of Basilica. and the resurrection of the tribute system in the neoliberalist economic stage. This further echoed the logic of transformation and profit making the interest of the state. This revival of Confucianism in China is a movement activated and proliferated through all sides, including the government, the academy in local provinces, and worshiping Confucius, and practiced by young kids, through the context of the knowledge of the classics, and all this practice of the costume in traditional dresses, 汉服社. More significantly is that a massive publication of different versions of Confucian textbook, curricula, and studies written by scholars and by non-academic writers emerged. Underneath this massive cultural restoration movement is the intention actually to decolonize the Western mode of thinking and to reactivate traditional Chinese values. All these books, Confucian Constitution, Confucian Return, Confucianist Scholar, and Modernization and Confucianism, and so on. Jiang Qing, of course, is one exemplary figure in the way of the Renaissance of Confucianism. His typical proposal was to denounce and reject all the political modernity introduced from the West, including the modern concept of equality, democracy, and the republican system. He thinks that the political modernity influenced by the West over the past 100 years is full of flaws. He argued that the 20th century is now over, and China should abandon all Western influences and move on into the 21st century by embracing its own traditional Confucianism. Moreover, he thinks that it is a heavenly mandate that China now has to return to the ancient, to revive conservatism, and to bring back classics as a foundation in order to rewrite national constitution. Gan Yang, another example, who suggested that through his concept of grand unification and bridging the three traditions, and to explain that China is a group of people who shared the same cultural tradition and customs through a long process of interaction in history and form the same cultural identity and civilization. China is unified, a unified political community with single sovereignty and reject any form of political secessions. And also, Chinese history is a homogeneous continuity. Each succeeding dynasty inherit and integrated the previous traditions into Chinese civilization, and so on. So it is based on this type of discourse that Jiang Shigong, another scholar, the rhetoric of the mandate of heaven and the operation of the grand unification, that scholars like Jiang Shigong would propose or publish a book, China, Hong Kong, and propose that Hong Kong naturally and necessarily should be a tributary of China, which means that the central government should take up the responsibility to take care of the security and stability of Hong Kong. And Hong Kong should follow the dictate of the central government and offer its tribute in the form of obedience. In this way, there's no chance, actually, we can see that for Hong Kong to establish any autonomy in its own legislature procedure for its own local affairs. But we actually need to think this imperial colonialism in Confucianism in this age of neoliberalism. The text of Jiang Qing, Gan Yang, and Jiang Shigong demonstrated the discursive and epistemic operation of Confucianism that provides a convenient framework that situates the dominant center and the subordinate periphery in a clearly defined hierarchical order. The tribute system practiced in the pre-modern Chinese Empire is now transformed into the geo-economics and the financial attachment system in the new world order, particularly today. The central paradox of the normative discourse of Confucianism is that while stressing the superiority of Confucian moral virtue and the kingly way, Wang Dao, of the emperor, who can lead the country to a harmonious and borderless world, historical facts prove that military forces were oftentimes unavoidable, like today in South China Sea. What is the tributary system? The imperial tributary system of China is used to be understood as a network of both foreign as well as trade relations between China and its tributaries in history, with mutually beneficial economic relationship. And members states of the system were mostly political, autonomous, and independent. But in the age of the altered economic and financial operation in contemporary global context, the historical process China had gone through from the beginning of the 20th century through the entire 20th century to the rapid rise in recent decades, it is impossible for the traditional so-called virtue to be assumed today, be it a mystical one or discursive one, or and so on. Recent studies, have observed that China is gradually building up a new world order through the economic partnership and multilateral organizations. There are different forms of this mutual lateral cooperation organizations, and like Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and One Belt One Road and so on. These newly formed organizations not only posed a challenge to the American-led world order, but also claimed not to repeat the 20th century Cold War confrontational model, not to form an alliance like NATO, but a partnership with no adversary in mind. But China's aggressive economic disposition, including the extended oil pipes, railroad, canal, and huge investment in foreign industries, through buying up the huge size of land and provinces, have already been criticized as neoliberal colonialism and created quite a few anti-Chinese sentiments in different countries. And the naval drill performed in May 2015, respectively by Japan and Philippines in South China Sea and the China-Russia alliance in Mediterranean Sea, the endpoint of the passage of the One Belt One Road economic zone, and also the continuing tension in South China Sea in today, demonstrated this newly formed battlefield of the struggle for the hegemony of economic blocs. New form of xenophobia emerged with a mixture of the communist phobia during the Cold War era of the 20th century. It's naturally to see that there is still an ambivalence toward this new economic power that China is representing now. The ambivalence lies in the fear of being swallowed up by the Chinese economic empire, as well as the desire to take part in a network and soar up with it, despite the fact that they resent the threat brought by China. Both U.S. and the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the members of EU are eager to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the International Development Bank and the Development Fund offered by China for various regions. If you join the team established by China and show your allegiance, then you'll be promised with trade preferences including reducing tariffs, offering partial profits, and providing aids for local development. Naturally, domestic government welcome this trade benefit and form a collaborative entrepreneurial partnership in their apparatus of cooperation. And this center-periphery economy attachment system speaks just the same logic as the one of pre-modern Chinese tributary system. In defending the different world order of Confucian paradigm to be introduced by the emerging China in the 21st century, James Xiong-Jie, another contemporary Confucian scholar, stressed that China had dominated the world economy for at least 1,000 years before the West's rise after the 15,000, and never developed the colonial rule as the West did. The rapid revival of the economic power of East Asian countries proved that those Asian societies that are mostly heavily imbued with Confucian influence fared the best and recovered the fastest. He also insisted that the China-led system, inspired by the Sinic virtues and values, was characterized by formal hierarchy but informal equality, which is contrary to the formal equality and informal hierarchy practiced by the Western tradition. Xiong's address was exemplary and demonstrated the core question here. Was the economic power of the Basinica that lasted more than 1,000 years the one and the same empire? Did the people of different ethnic groups and in different dynasties share the equality that Xiong and other Confucian scholars profess to be? Moreover, it is clear that the Basinica of the 21st century, if it is ever to take place, would never be the same pre-modern empire it once claimed to be, in whatever form of whatever historical dynasties. China had gone through the transformation of modernization, the Enlightenment legacy of enriching the country and strengthening the military 富国强兵, was deeply rooted in the Chinese psychological infrastructures. Within the 2 decades after 1989, China has rapidly emerged as a super economic and financial power in the global world stage of neoliberalism, not to mention its potential military power as demonstrated not only in the economic, the constant Navy drill, but also in the disposition of the medium-range ballistic missiles along the southeast coast. So what is the stake for Taiwan today? Why does this issue matter to Taiwan? It matters greatly because Taiwan is currently trapped within these two neoliberal super economic empires between US and China. Even though Taiwan has long passed a colonial history ruled by Japan from 1895 through 1945 and overcome the authoritarian regime of the martial law period ruled by KMT government and under protection of US since the beginning of the Cold War and lasted till 1987, and moved into the age of globalization with the neoliberalist market economy and the strategy of New South Advanced Policy, 新南进政策, moving southward. Different traces of coloniality still remain in the society of Taiwan. So the symptomatic scenario of the March 18 event of 2014 in Taiwan, or the Sunflower occupation movement, spelled out the aporia Taiwan is facing now in front of these two economic empires. The direct target of this occupation movement was to protest against the passing of the Cross-Strait Service Trade Agreement by the ruling party KMT government without clause-by-clause review. On the surface, the appeal of this occupation was clear and univocal. But a closer look, this trade agreement treaty seems to be equal to anti-China or anti-communism. So we see the diversity of the addresses that attracted different audiences, particularly the discontent of the proletarianized younger generation. But among these different voices, a particular mode of anti-China sentiment stood up, emphatically emphasizing the impending threat from China that Taiwan would soon become Hong Kong if no resistance was to take place. Facing the huge economic power represented by China, this alert against China and the fear of losing Taiwan's economic autonomy is justifiable in realistic sense. But without thorough analysis of the current situation and the aporia Taiwan is facing, this anti-China sentiment would only be the return of the phantom of the communist phobia, a residue from the Cold War syndrome, and an echo of the China threat that has been prevailing in the West, particularly in U.S. The United States re-entry into the Trans-Pacific region with a determination to rebalance toward the Asia-Pacific through the Cold War alliance, such as Trans-Pacific Partnership and so on. By rejecting this ECFA and CSSTA offered by China, the pro-independent protesters, 独派 of the occupation movement in Taiwan, did not mean to reject the U.S.-Japan alliance through the TPP or other modules of transnational entrepreneurial cooperation. And the so-called leftist, 左统, leftist unification group in Taiwan, on the other hand, while insisting of the anti-colonial, anti-American position, was persuaded by the alluring vision of the unification with a prosperous picture of the Greater China Economic Bloc and welcomed the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the One Belt, One Road picture proposed by China. So either it is a route of reunification with China, joining the collaborative entrepreneurial partnership, and resume into a tribute system as Hong Kong is expected, or it is the opposite route to seek U.S. alliance in order to fight against the threat from China. Taiwan is trapped in the same apparatus of area partition and cooperation partnership. So we can see the investment from China. That's a picture of an area in Taipei, and the rapid growth of the investment in recent years. But not only there's an investment from China, but transnational investment that's being planning to buy up the east coast of Taiwan as a resource center and so on. And of course, industrial development, pollution, and so on. From the very beginning, for example, Liang Qichao in the Enlightenment movement, his discourse of the new people employed the discourse of 国家 nation as 公司 corporation. His description of imperial court as administrative office, and he talked about how to produce and what is the total capital and total labor is a force, production force from the people, including their physical force and their psychic force, and also moral force, 德力. And what is a 德力, moral force? It's 功德 for the group, for the society, for the nation, and to value martial law exercises and to be harmonious in the society. But there are a group of translations, interesting and very strange texts, like John Fryer, a missionary in China, introduced this terms, psychic force, through a translation of ideal suggestions through mental photography. But this is a book by a religious person in the 19th century of U.S. But this is within the New Thought movement. The New Thought movement, and in his discourse, psychic force is described as electricity, could be measured, directed, tamed, accumulated, and exercised and counted, okay, and could be governed too. And he has also translated a book, 佐治除言, but this is a textbook of the Scottish Enlightenment, in which the entire division of the West and the barbarian and so on was in the book. And the same book was translated by Fukuzawa Yukichi, 福泽谕吉, in his 西洋纪事 Seiyo Jisho, and was repeated in his 文明论概略, outline of a theory of civilization, of course including other texts. But Liang Qichao also was at the same time with Tokutomi Soho, and he actually plagiarized Tokutomi's concept in his discourse of the youth, discourse of the national 元气, 国民元气. And Tokutomi Soho, most interestingly, is that he wrote about the genealogy of empire, 帝国, and said 帝国 empire, the spirit of empire is the instinct of national citizen. And so that he wrote a book on the Greater Japan, the expansion of Greater Japan in Asia. But those concepts were embraced by Liang Qichao. At the same time, okay, there's a book, very interestingly, a translation of Gustav Franz. The book was The Physiology of the State, introduced by the Ministry of Education, 文部省, in Japan in the 1884. And Kokutai, 国体, was employed in their translation to describe the organic whole of the nation, including the constitution to the citizen to everything. Okay, we can see clearly in Liang Qichao his discourse, but also all those his contemporaries and the Japanese intellectuals. A different perspective. Zhang Taiyan, Liang Qichao's contemporary, okay, criticized the concept of this nationalist, such as Liang Qichao and Yang Du, by proposing several. He had a series of critique of his own time, but he proposed the concept of nation as a riverbed, serving as a place of emptiness that can allow the river to pass by daily. 空处, 河床. And the nation has no substance of its own, but appears only as a mobile condition, 只有动态, 无实体. And it's only a dynamic moment of the constitutional organization. So he viewed it as a temporary dynamic composition, as a movement of the, like the textile woven by Huab and Wolf, 经纬相交, 此为组织. And he also stressed that the love for the nation, 爱国心, was not to love the fixated present state, 非爱其现在之正有, but to love the composition and the not yet germinated, 渴望其未萌芽者, the to come in the future. We could actually see Taiwan as this riverbed because throughout centuries, Taiwan has been traversed, inhabited by different people, different cultures, and recompose its own society again and again. So through this analysis of this syncretization and hypostatization of certain concepts, and we could see more clearly how to unbind from the fixated identity politics or concept of so-called nationhood and national citizen. But to re-examine the complex historical conditions to expose the unequal exchange of values and the demand of the time, and to envision the concept of community and of the nation, so that the enunciation of certain eminent critique could be possible. So I'll end here. Yeah.